Welcome to Wine and the Word. I'm Gail Bach, pastor of Stewardship and Evangelism. As I began to prepare for this session of Wine and the Word, we were just entering the season of Advent. Advent marks a time when we turn over the calendar of another year in the life of the church. It's a time when we once again hear the stories of prophecies being fulfilled, and the family tree of the promised Messiah is just about complete. The Gospel of Matthew begins this era of God's people by going back for just a few minutes. He wants to assure us that the child that's about to be born is the Messiah that was promised generations ago. And he does this by listing the names of Jesus' family tree going all the way back to Abraham. If you take a close look at this list, you'll notice that besides Mary, there are only 4 other women named on this family tree. They are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, who is Bathsheba. Given that it was a time when the cultural norms and the laws did place very little value on the role of women in life, it's not surprising that there are only 4 women on the list. In fact, if anything, it's probably even more surprising that there are women on this list at all. So today, what I'd like to do is explore with you what brought these 4 women and gave these 4 women the recognition to put them on this list. What made them different from other women? And maybe more importantly, what does their presence on this list have to say to us today? So I'd like to start with Tamar. Tamar's story is a complicated one. It's found in the book of Genesis, and it's a story of grief and justice and determination. Tamar was the wife of Judah's first son, who died shortly after they got married. Tamar then married Judah's second son, who also died after they were married. Now, Judah had promised his third son, his last son, to Tamar, but not until he was old enough. And so in the meantime, Tamar would have to return to her family. What she learned later is that Judah had no intention of fulfilling that promise. And being ineligible to marry because officially she was still engaged to Judah's third son, she had to find ways to bring justice to her situation. She had a rightful place in the house of Judah, and through no fault of her own, she was being denied that right. So following the death of Judah's wife, Tamar had a plan. She posed as a prostitute, and Judah fell for her disguise. Tamar became pregnant by him, but cleverly protected both her identity and secured the proof that Judah was the father of her child. When he learned she was pregnant, he was furious, and he was harshly condemning her until she pulled out her proof that he was the father of her child. Judah was finally forced to confess his relations with Tamar. In a culture where women have so few rights, Tamar became one of the first women in the Bible to practice civil disobedience. She publicly challenged the wrong that Judah had done to her, knowing that if she was not successful, it would probably cost her her life. Judah was in a position of power and authority as the leader of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, yet he had abused his position. As a result of Tamar's trickery, powerful Judah became vulnerable and weak, and powerless Tamar took on authority and strength. The second woman named on the family tree is Rahab. Her story is found in the book of Joshua. She's a prostitute, she's a Gentile, and they live in Jericho. She was the sole provider for her parents and her siblings. And she had heard stories about the Israelites, how they had escaped out of Egypt, and how they had crossed the Red Sea and defeated powerful neighbors. She knew that Jericho was the gateway to Canaan, the land that God had seemed to promise the people of Israel. An attack on her city was inevitable. So Rahab had come to understand that the God of Israel would prevail. So despite the extreme risk she was taking of betraying her own people, she decided she would help the spies of Israel on the promise that they would also spare her family. Well, the Israelites did finally attack Jericho, and they did prevail, and Rahab's family was spared. It would be so easy to judge Rahab based on her profession, which had already isolated her from much of her own community. But she did what she believed was necessary to take care of her family and herself. Rahab would trust the God of Israel and is living proof of how God works even through the most unlikely of us to bring about the plans that God has for us. Rahab has shown us that God's grace is truly for all people. The third woman on the list is a Gentile. It is Ruth, and she is also one of only 2 women who has a book of the Bible named after her. Ruth's story is about inclusion. It's about the qualities that hold a family together across boundary lines of ethnicity and religion. Her story is about kindness and loyalty and commitment. Her story also teaches us a lot about God's loving kindness and faithfulness to those who show kindness and faithfulness to others. Ruth is also a widow, and after her husband dies, her mother-in-law Naomi gave Ruth permission to return home. Being a widow herself, Naomi had no way to provide financial support for Ruth, nor did she have any sons that Ruth could marry. Naomi also believed what her Hebrew tradition had carefully taught her, and that was that a woman was of little value without a man. To live with the protection of without a male heir, it was a terrifying prospect. Ruth could have returned home to her mother and father. However, she chose to stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi. She sacrificed a life that would have provided for her for a life of uncertainty and potentially severe hardship and poverty. However, because of the faithfulness to Naomi, Ruth's journey leads her to Boaz, who marries her. And because of her faithfulness and love, a family that seemed destined to come to an end was given new life. And the Messiah's family tree had another branch. Finally, we meet Bathsheba, or the wife of Uriah, as she's named in Matthew. Bathsheba married David, but she did not properly belong to him. She had been seduced by David, who was Israel's greatest king, and to some extent she was complicit, though as the powerful one in the relationship, David certainly carried much of the responsibility of what happened. He had instigated adultery with Bathsheba, the beautiful wife of one of his finest generals, whose name was Uriah. After learning that Bathsheba was now pregnant by him, and to protect himself, David had Uriah placed on the front lines of battle, where he was sure to be killed. Bathsheba was a resilient woman. In facing many multiple counts of grief, such as when she lost her husband, Uriah, or her first child, David's son. Bathsheba is silent through much of the biblical narrative. However, her marriage to David eventually gives her a voice through her son, Solomon, who later becomes king. Bathsheba eventually becomes one of the most influential and most powerful women of Israel. Her story again teaches us that even in the most unexpected and sometimes very difficult situations, God is always at work in us and through us and with us. So, we have 4 unlikely women who found themselves in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Laws and customs worked against any reason for them to have had a good fortune. But God was faithful. And through these women, the nature of God is just a little clearer for all of us. God's love and faithfulness is more evident to us, not just for some people, but for all people. The women in these stories found the strength and the courage to go against the cultural norms in their day and make things right for themselves and others. These women prodded Israel to remember that it's in its failures to recognize the despised and the enemy and the foreigner and the outsider as agents of God's work. And it failed to remember its own history of alienation. The lives of these women helped to set the stage for Jesus. Throughout this ministry, Jesus exhibited passion for justice. He touched those who were unclean, including women. He healed the sick on the Sabbath, including women. He was a friend of tax collectors and sinners, including women. And he spoke to social outcasts in public, and he listened to their concerns, including the concerns of women. Like the women in these stories, without position or power, Jesus depended on the goodwill and the hospitality of others for food and for lodging. They were all marginalized by those in authority. Our Christian roots are woven into the fabric of the female ancestors of Jesus. These women courageously challenged the status quo when it no longer served to bring justice to their lives. As heirs to their faithfulness, we are all called to do the same. In a future session of Wine and the Word, we will explore more about how the events in more recent times have shown us where change is still needed to address the injustices in our lives and in our society, and the challenges that get in the way of our ability to make such changes. I hope you have found this session of Wine and the Word helpful, and it offers you seeds for good conversation in your time together. God bless.